Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for coming, especially it's a Saturday. So inshallah, today we are honored that we have Professor Khaled Keshk. I will introduce him very briefly, inshallah. So, mashallah, he's the chair of the Religious Studies Department in DePaul University. He specializes in early Islamic history. And for example, he has a book about called The Historians Muawiyah, about the first Umayyad Caliph, and inshallah, he will be talking today about subhanallah. Now, so inshallah we'll read the whole title, How a Prophetic Hadith Sheds Light on Modern Scholarship. So inshallah we'll start. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Would you like, okay, so if I'll hold it, and please tell me if I'm not properly talking. Right. This way? Okay. Everybody can hear me? Okay. Is this fine or more up? Okay? All right. So, what I'm talking today about is when I talk about a prophetic hadith that sheds lights on modern scholarship, is that you are all familiar, of course, on the hadith about intention. You know, that which has the Amir al-Mu'mineen Abu Hafs Umar ibn al-Khattab said, I heard the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam saying, actions are only by intentions, and every man has only that which he intended. And I was thinking about this hadith and how it, you know, helps us in understanding modern scholarship on Islam. And I looked at three incidents. One incident is the killing of Uthman, and the second incident is the Battle of the Camel, and a third incident was looking at a hadith also from collections, and how different modern scholars who, and I'm not saying that their intention was necessarily bad or good. I'm not giving their intentions a moral dilemma, but I'm certainly saying that their intentions did shape their scholarship or their findings about these things, and how one's intention does shape the final product in such a way that not knowing that intention can obscure true scholarship or true understanding of what this product is. For example, I'm not sure if you are all familiar with Ignaz Goldziher, who lived from 1850 to 1921. He was a very well-known Western scholar on hadith, and he was very much the person who laid the foundation for this Western understanding of hadith, which has been proven you know, wrong through other scholars, such as most recently by Harold Motsky, this idea that most hadiths are forged. Okay, and Ignaz Goldziher, he, even though he was convinced of the superiority of Islam, which he wrote in his memoir. He says, I became inwardly convinced that I myself was a Muslim, and judiciously discovered that this was the only religion which, even in its doctrinal and official formulation, can satisfy philosophical minds. But he was a Hungarian Jew. He said he remained a Jew, and he said that he wanted to elevate Judaism to a similar rational level. He felt he was not only on a mission for Judaism, but also for Islam. And that is, he wanted also to kind of reform Islam, what he thought his reformation, which is, interestingly enough, sometimes happens with these intellectuals that you find talking all over the United States, who have this vision of trying to reform Islam for some reason, when they really should reform themselves first before they come to reform Islam. Well, anyway, he looked at, and what I look at his how his intention sort of completely shaped his understanding and his conclusion, is I look at his understanding of a hadith about field dogs, right? It is a hadith from Tirmizi that it was related by Ibn Umar that the Prophet, peace be upon him, ordered all dogs to be killed except for the hounds and sheepdogs. Abu Huraira added the words أو زرع, or field dogs, whereupon Ibn Umar remarked that Abu Huraira owned cultivated land. Now, Golds here says, well, this proves that the hadiths are all spurious. Why? Because he says that the remark of Ibn Umar proves that even the earliest transmitters were not free from selfish and dishonest motives. So he feels that Ibn Umar's remark is a remark done because, or added to the hadith, that this is, sorry, Abu Huraira's remark was added to the hadith, and Ibn Umar sort of remarked that, oh, you know this because you own fields. That means you are adding to the hadith because this is for your self-interest. This is, in fact, a reflection about how your intent, right, which here is an intent and understanding that people are selfish, are dishonest, right, in their motivations, colors that conclusion. When in fact, and this is Siddiqui writes in his book, which this is Hadith Literature, Its Origin, Development, and Special Features by Muhammad Zubair Siddiqui, right? He writes, the Muslim traditionists, however, have explained Ibn Umar's remark as meaning that Abu Huraira, being possessed of personal experience of the subject matter of this hadith, was in a better position to know exactly what his wording was. That is what Siddiqui illustrates is that intent can actually color completely your scholarly outlook. This analysis from Golds here shows that if your intent or niyyah is to prove that all hadiths were forged in order to support one argument over another, then even when given evidence of the perfect illustration of how one companion helped another remember more details of the hadith because of their life circumstances, here these are selfish reasons, using the word in its most benign understanding, because they own fields, is taken to mean that it was a motivation to invent and forge rather than to remember. Okay? So this is very a clear example. Not so clear examples is when we come to Islamic history. Because Islamic history can sort of it can be subjected to clear biases by scholars who might rely on these old works in order to elevate these biases. And I'm taking as an example a scholar by the name of Wilfred Madelung. Wilfred Madelung, who wrote the book The Succession to Muhammad, right? He wrote this book. He was commissioned by the Ismailis to write this book in order to prove, in order to bring about an idea that really the succession to the Prophet ﷺ was supposed to be to Ali and not that Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu anhum were usurping this idea, which is very, I mean, it's not a scholarly approach, but it is a very doctrinal approach to history. But he couched it in a scholarly way by writing this book, by saying he's only writing what the sources have to say. So his intent is to prove that the Ismaili doctrine and idea of history, right, is the correct way, and he's looking at the sources, the same sources that other scholars, whether they're Sunni, whether they're Shia, whether they're secular, and you know, whatever they are, they're looking at the same sources. Okay, so the one, and I, you know, I passed out this graph. The killing of Uthman in the Islamic sources is made up of 4 acts. Now, these 4 acts are the Act 1 is the siege, right? Act 2 and Act 3, Act 4. I have them in the chart in front of you, and how the Islamic sources look at what are these acts very briefly, and then I say if Madelung accepts these ideas. The other person I look at to compare to Madelung is Dr. Abdul Hadi Al-Ajmi, who is a scholar also of history, who looks at the same incident, but comes with a completely different conclusion. And I'll have you be the judge about which conclusion, you know, is acceptable. I won't put it, you know, but I'll lay out each person's approach. Now, there are a number of details that I'm not going to talk about because they are what one may say in modern parlance color commentary. They are really there in order for the historian to illustrate his biases through the narrative. They don't affect the outcome of the story, but rather one's take of the story. So Act 1 is all the narratives that have the Kufans, Basrans, and the Egyptians who were angry with Uthman's policies head towards Medina. That's Act 1. Act 2 is these rebels begin making demands of Uthman, who is surprisingly very accessible throughout, and Uthman acceding to these demands. Act 3 is the rebels satisfied, leave, and those from Kufa and Basra go towards Iraq, and those from Fustat go towards Egypt. Then the Egyptians, right, intercept a lone man on a camel, and after integrating and searching him, find that he has a letter from Uthman to the governor of Egypt demanding their severe punishment, in some cases execution. They take Uthman's messenger and return to Medina, where they're met again by those from Kufa and Basra. Act 4 is the integration of Uthman as to the author of the letter, and then his siege, after which the rebels kill Uthman. Now, Madelung, right, he believes that first in his depiction of Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, is that in Act 1, he puts forward or tries to prove that Uthman deserved to be killed, that Uthman was an oppressive ruler, that he deserved to be killed. So he uses all those colorful, what I call colorful commentary, in order to set that about. Act 2, and more importantly, sorry, not in Act 2, but also for his trying to prove, is that Ali had little to nothing to do with the rebels. Also one of his main points. That the rebels had legitimate grievances and that Uthman was sinful and sinister, and his Umayyad advisors were one and the same, especially Marwan. Okay, Marwan bin al-Hakam, who's the cousin of Uthman, that he works in order to show that Marwan really was behind many of these things, including the letter that was intercepted by the Egyptians. That the stories about the sons of the companions protecting Uthman is accurate, and it was Marwan who escalated the siege by killing one of the members of the siege, causing the violent reaction of the people besieging Uthman and killing Uthman. Now, if we sit back and try to look at this in a as much as objective a possibility as possible, one finds that there's a number of problems, okay? Least of which is the problem about how did the companions, or at least the sons of the companions, like Abdullah bin al-Zubair, Hussein bin Ali, Hassan bin Ali, Abdullah bin Umar, and Muhammad bin Talha, all who were supposedly protecting Uthman, right, failed at this protection, right? There's something missing. There's something that does not make sense. Dr. Al-Ajami accepts Acts 1 and 2, right? And he adds to Acts 2 the killing of Uthman. For Dr. Al-Ajami, if we cannot accept Acts 3 and 4, sorry, for Dr. Al-Ajami, he says we cannot accept Acts 3 and 4. For to do so, one needs to accept illogical narrations. For instance, how did the Kufans and Basrans return when it was the Egyptians who intercepted the so-called messenger? You know, they're going towards Iraq, they're going towards Egypt, but yet they come back, and there is no logic to that. One cannot accept the story of the second siege and murder without also accepting the large conspiratorial role of Marwan and the ineptitude of the rest of the companions and their sons, who were supposedly guarding Uthman. No, for Dr. Al-Ajmi, logic, and here I would say the niyyah for clarity and non-sectarianism would necessitate that there were rebels from Kufa, Basra, and Fustat who came to Medina to complain about fiscal and governors. That is true. One can accept that. That Uthman did consent to all these issues and compromise with the rebels, that also can be accepted. What Dr. Al-Ajmi adds is that when the rebels saw the compromises of Uthman, they were then emboldened. They are powerful. They felt and they saw, according to Dr. Ajmi, that they are powerful enough to have the Caliph, Amir al-Mu'minin, do whatever they want. They asked him to take away the governors. They asked him to change certain monetary issues in favor of them. They asked him for everything, and he accepted, but relented. They became like, okay, so why do we need him? You know, why don't we have him resign? Why don't we have him removed? And that is when Uthman refused. This request, of course, as it's very clear, was refused by Uthman, then they killed him. So for Dr. Al-Ajmi, it was really Act 1, Act 2, right? And there is no Act 3 and 4, okay? And using that and understanding that, you have a consequences for the scholarship in two areas. One, it takes away the illogic that you have to accept if you accept Acts 3 and 4. That's one. That's an important one. But two, and more importantly, you as a scholar and as a Muslim scholar don't have to start doing all kinds of scholarly acrobatic moves in order to try to understand how was Uthman killed with many of the companions being there. Okay? If you accept Acts 3 and 4, then you accept that the companions just sat back and did not do anything, which is unacceptable. All right. The second story is the Battle of the Camel. And this one, I took also Madelung's approach to the Battle of the Camel. And I also looked at a article by the scholar, this scholar named Landau, who she inadvertently explains the Battle of the Camel. She was not trying to. That was not her main purpose. But in her looking at the narrator, Saif bin Omar, she actually explains that away. Now, there are 4 acts in the Battle of the Camel. Okay, I'm going to talk only on the first 3. Act 1 is the 2 armies, one under Ali and the other under Talha, Zubair, and Aisha, meet, and conversations and negotiations begin between the two groups. Act 2, the rebels who were responsible for the killing of Uthman begin to get extremely nervous because reconciliation is in the air. Act 3, the rebels attack each camp at dawn, thus throwing the two sides into chaos and open hostilities. For this narrative, Madelung does the exact opposite of what he did to the narrations on the killing of Uthman, but for the same intent. He dismisses Acts 1 and 2 because they would disavow the main culprits who were the killers of Uthman and part of Ali's army. He does so by stating that there was obviously no room for negotiation and compromise, that the battle took place because of the intransigence, deception, jealousy of Talha al-Zubair, more so Abdullah bin Zubair, and Aisha. Again, Madelung's niyyah is to blame the companions, and especially Aisha, for what occurred. Now, another scholar, Ella Landau Tasserson, who in her paper entitled Saif ibn Omar in Medieval and Modern Scholarship, her intent was to argue that Saif ibn Omar was wrongly dismissed by Western and non-Western scholars as a liar and exaggerator whose narrations about the Ridda were only to try and exonerate his tribe of Tamim. So her work is completely about just the Ridda wars. It's not about the Battle of the Camel. And her work is about Saif ibn Omar, the one that the narrations, most of the early Islamic scholars use, where he talks about Act 1 negotiations, Act 2 trepidations, and Act 3 war, where they utilize some part of that. Now, she says that if one looks and compares his narrations with other historians, one finds that they are quite accurate and very logical. And although the article is mostly on the Ridda Wars, Landau inadvertently illustrates that the account above has an inner logic that is unavoidable. That is the account about the Battle of the Camel. she says, and I quote, many sources describe a near settlement between the two parties, that they do not explain why this settlement was not consummated after all, and hostilities broke out. So she explains that all the sources, all the early sources, when they talk about the Battle of the Camel, right, they all agree that there were negotiations, that when Ali, Talha, Zubair, and Aisha were negotiating, that there seemed to be a settlement about to happen. But then suddenly you go into hostilities and war breaks out. She explained that Saif's story that the killers of Uthman were afraid that a settlement meant the handing over or punishment of Uthman's murderers, since they had been involved in the murder before they joined Ali, they would be the losers were such a settlement carried out. Therefore, they secretly attacked both camps, thus disrupting the negotiations and provoking the battle. She says that if we look at that, it makes perfect sense, and it explains why these negotiations broke down. Of course, Madelung, in order to move away from this possibility and not even look at those sort of provocateurs that are in Ali's camp, right, of the murders of Uthman, he has to completely forget about the possibility of that there was any negotiation or any settlements, even though most Islamic, if not all Islamic early historians talk about these negotiations. Now, I hope that here I have what I've done, and I've sort of done it in this way in order to open it up for questions and see where, more details about this. But what I was trying to illustrate here is that when we are reading modern scholarship about the Islamic sources, which we do when we read the early Islamic sources on history, when we read the early Islamic sources on history, we are given in the academia, in the Western academia, we are always taught that, they probably wrote this because they want to prove this. You really have to look at, for instance, Tabari. Why is Tabari writing about this? Why is he adding this narrative as opposed to that other narrative? You need to look at this. You need to look at that. But then when we come to secondary scholarship done by Western scholarship, we are never asked, and we're never told, well, look at what their intent is. Madelung is working for this, or he's doing this, or Donner is doing this. We're never told to look at the motivation or the intent of the modern scholar. I say that that's a lacking that actually makes us lose a certain ability that is very profoundly important, and that is knowing the intent of the scholars, of the modern scholars, which is much easier to find than looking at the intent of early Islamic scholars, historians, right, is a vital part of scholarship and should be a vital part of our scholarship when we are trying to talk about Islamic history, especially. Yes. Why do you feel that the older scholars of the Oh, I'm not saying that intention should not be questioned. I think their intention should be questioned, but I'm saying that it's much easier, we're asked to question these intentions, but we're asked not to question the modern scholars' intention. And I say it's much easier to find the modern scholars' intention than it is the older scholars. And talking about, for instance, the early Islamic historians, it's very hard unless a Muslim historian, like, for instance, Tabari, Al-Mas'udi, Yaqubi, Ibn Asakir, Ibn Khalikan, all these historians, they rarely say what they're going to put and what they're not going to put. Very rarely, meaning what their intentions are, right? So you have to look at their background, look at their overall history, see how they interact with some of the stories and all that. That's one. The second thing is when you do that, you find a very interesting thing, is that all Muslim historians, no matter what they might want to prove or disprove, are very honest when it comes to history. That is, every single one of them, none of them, however, whatever their leanings are, obfuscate an incident. They all agree that the Prophet ﷺ died, and that there was a Saqifa incident where Abu Bakr was given the bay'ah. Okay, they all agree about that. Now, whether they agree about how did this bay'ah come about, who gave it, who did not give it, that's where they disagree. But incidents and what happened in Islamic history, they're very, very, very accurate, and they're very consistent about it. All right, but what happened and who was doing what and why, right? They're very different, and they have certain intent to prove one or the other. Of course, but that is absolutely true. Their intention is driving their conclusion, but they don't. What happens sometimes is that you're more let me put it. Okay, so let's take, for instance, what Madelung does, right? Madelung has the proof to try to show that indeed it was Uthman, for instance. Let's take the story of Uthman. Uthman was deserved to die, right? And that Muawiyah, right, was not only wrong, but actually him and Amr bin al-As were non-believers. Okay, all right, and that this was now he says, and he does, from the Islamic history. He said, he gets from the sources. He says, this is all from the sources, right? So you look at all the sources, right, and you read the sources, and if you read a certain line of the sources, you find that there are stories in the histories whereby pro-Alid sources, anti-Muawiyah sources. There is hardly any pro-Muawiyah sources. Okay, so you're sort of like anti-Muawiyah source, but you never find a source that shows that until you go to a more sectarian source like Bahar and Anwar, you know, there is no source, historical source that accuses Muawiyah of being a kafir. Okay, but Madelon does that by his approach to these sources, in sense of showing that this is what motivated Muawiyah. Like, he will say, and he will use phrases like, he thought, he was thinking, he knew, he did not know, right? You won't find that in the Islamic sources. The Islamic sources will have, you know, he said this, this group said this group said this, and these narratives are contradictory, right? But the overall narrative is for a certain point of view. Like, for instance, if we take Tabari, the overall narrative is pro-Abbasid. All right? That, you know, not necessarily Uthman deserved to die, but Muawiyah, that Uthman was being too pro-Umayyad for his clan, and this is this thing that except, you know, and that Muawiyah really should not have you know, fought Ali, right? He was an illegitimate person fighting Ali, but then he becomes legitimate because he rules, because Hassan gives him the thing. So this kind of narrative, you know, is an Abbasid it's the Abbasid narrative, right? But within it, he also has bits and pieces of the other narratives that you can see that while the facts are there, right, there is a possibility to build a counter narrative for that. There is no counter narrative in Madelon. Madelon goes one step further, okay, and one step further is to create a very different character that is an evil character, that has machinations, that is thoughts, which is not, you know, a historian cannot do that, because you don't know what is the motivations behind certain people, and you don't know what is, you know, how does he know that, you know, Muawiyah did this or did that, you know, in these things. And this is illustrated also very well by Goldsmith. Like, you know, Goldsmith looks at an incident that is clear. I mean, this hadith about Muslim is a clear hadith. There is no dispute that Ibn Umar was the one who was narrating the hadith, that Abu Huraira reminded about added thing, and that Ibn Umar said, oh, it's because you own a field. So all these three are exact. But if you see what the conclusion comes from Goldsmith, as opposed to the conclusion that comes from Siddiqui or Muslim historians, those are very, very, very different conclusions that have quite a profound difference of, you know, again, so, you know, one says that proves that all hadiths are forgeries, even early ones, while another proves that no, this is, look how the system works. The system is working well. So that's quite a very different approach. Yes. Yes. And that knowing that intention is very important. I think that we. Yes, I understand. Yes, I am that. That's true. But I'm saying that you can within, you know, not totally accurate, but within remarkably close. By looking at the intention of the author, you can see how that colors their scholarship.
So building on what you said, so about historians, usually, especially early Islamic historians, and even to a later extent, they are included in kutub al-tarajim and kutub, to some degree, jarh wa ta'dil. So there is an evaluation that happened very early on within the Islamic tradition, that sometimes, you know, they talk about the person, the background, they might question the intention. So that's not something new for the early. Now, for modern scholars, this is a little bit problematic in the sense that modern scholars, they like to study others, but they don't like to be studied. And that's, in a sense, explained the strong reactions to, for example, books like Orientalism, where the Orientalist, the modern Western scholar, was the subject of study. And until now, I mean, people who study either the Middle East or area studies, generally speaking, they don't like that approach. And their reaction is, you know, sometimes they go to the extreme in the sense that the person who does that is not very welcome, and it becomes very personal. And now we know, for example, sometimes you don't need to know the intention, but a very common question: who is funding the study? And this happens even in hard sciences. You know, for example, in pharmacy, you know, especially in pharmacy, you have to declare whether you are funded or not for other scholars to take you seriously. Because if you are funded, you know, with a company that promotes that product, and you are doing a scientific study, there is a question mark, at least. So, yeah, the fact that this is not only in humanities.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, no, I agree. But also, the other thing is that, you know, I'll take your two comments, I'll separate your two comments. In early Islamic history, the most interesting thing about Ilm al-Rijal and all that is that you find, for instance, like Al-Waqidi, right, or Ibn Ishaq, who are historians. They are known as liars, or you know, people who insert when it comes to the hadith, and you know their hadith is not true. You know, so but they're also at the same time seen as excellent historians. There was a criteria, there was a science, and this is something that modern scholarship has not, you know, has asked but has not answered. Is that what happened? Why did, I mean, it can be answered in the sense of because one is more important than the other, but also that doesn't explain it all the way. But why did the muhaddithun, right, create a science of, you know, checking of who is transmitting, what the background is, their professional abilities? All this went into their process, right? So if you want to be a muhaddith, you had to, you know, have certain criteria. This was certain ways to do it. All this was going on. But if you want to be an akhbari, right, who transmits stories and history, there wasn't that great amount of research into who you are, how you're doing, or that. Or maybe there was, okay, but there wasn't a certain type of scrutiny that a muhaddith was. Why is that? I mean, this is a very interesting. Why is that? You know, until we come, of course, to Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun comes up and then he creates a theory, right, about history and how history should be understood and how it should be approached, and there is a science about it. Anyway, This is a very important distinction. The other distinction and the other problem, and this is a problem with modern scholarship, modern Islamic scholarship, which is a very interesting one, is that the methodology of modern Islamic scholarship in the West, right, has its merits. There is a merit for source criticism. You know, there is a real merit about that. But coupled with that merit of source criticism is the history of that scholarship, which really taints that scholarship, like you were saying, in this Orientalist way, because that scholarship was not as other scholarship, whereby it's a natural outgrowth, right, of trying to study material, whether it's history, theology, right? It's not a natural outgrowth, but it's actually an imposition, colonial outgrowth, in order to study a group of people that you are trying to conquer. Because it was tainted as that, and because it has had a very hard time trying to dismantle from this, right? There is always episode after episode of that Orientalist approach coming back and back and coming back, you know, and we see it also in our modern day, whereby you don't see the field of Islamic history in the West is very strange on this point, in that you have, for instance, I mentioned Gold's here, right? So you have, for instance, in Hadith studies, you had people like Gold's here, Schacht, Joinball, who were talking about Hadith studies and what happened, and that well, Hadith was mostly forged, and then it became a little bit tweaked, and it's like, no, only the Hadith that were part of law was forged, and then on. And then you come to the modern time, whereby this scholar named by Harold Motsky, who proves that this is ridiculous. One cannot say that the Hadith was forged, because it just doesn't make any scholarly sense. And he went through the process, and he proved that that is a ridiculous statement. But if this was any other field, if it was any other field other than Islam, let's say it was Christian studies or studies about Christianity or Jewish studies, right? Harold Motsky's ideas, because his ideas and his theory proved that Schacht, Joinball, and Goldshear were wrong, right? Then you would only study Goldshear, Schacht, and Joinball as examples of where the field went wrong, and now we are in Motsky's field. But that doesn't happen. What happens is actually the opposite, is that you have scholars who are getting their PhD, who have gotten their PhD, who insist that, no, Goldshear is still right, Joinball is still right, Schacht is still right, and really I don't really need to look at Motsky. And that is part of the Orientalism. That is part of the field. And it's very hard to extract it and remove it from the study of Islamic history and any Islamic sciences in the West. Modern scholarship, very easily. Whenever you find a book, whenever you're reading a book, find out exactly what, like Dr. Shukri says, who funded these books, a background about the person, what exactly other works that person has done. So this is very important. It's very important to find that out, and it's also important because it allows you. I mean, I'm not saying this as a malevolent thing to do. You're not trying to. I'm not asking you to destroy or go out and sort of like impute all these scholars. No, it's important to understand where the scholar is coming from. It's important for you to understand the scholarship and the book that you're reading. All right, because if you don't understand where the scholar is coming from, you cannot understand the scholar. And this is also you do when you read, for instance, you read the history of Al-Tabari. If you read the history of Al-Tabari, you cannot read the history of Al-Tabari without knowing who Al-Tabari was. Okay, if you don't know who Al-Tabari was, or if you read the history of Masoudi or Murush al-Zahab, for instance, and you don't know that Masoudi was Shi'i, right? You won't understand how he's doing his history, right? The same thing with Yaqubi, the same thing with Tabari, all early Islamic historians. You have to know who they are, and you have to know who they are and what they represent. That's a part of scholarship.
My question is, so correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying that in the Islamic sources there are sources that mention the interception of a letter from Uthman to the Egyptian governor, and there are narratives about the besiegement and then the killing of Uthman. But Dr. Al-Ajmi does not discounts those sources?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Yes. Dr. Ajmi says that when we look at who this person, for instance, when we look at about who's the person who is sent, who is the person taking that letter to the Egyptians, right? And we look at who supposedly wrote the letter to the Egyptians, we find that these are utilized in order to besmirch two people that played a later role in the Umayyad dynasty against the other groups. Okay, but it does not make any logical sense. For instance, if we look at Marwan bin al-Hakam is a very interesting character. Why is he an interesting character? There is, of course, an issue that he was brought. His father was exiled by the Prophet, and he was brought back by Uthman, right? And Uthman had a very close relationship with Marwan. Also, Marwan is the founder of the Umayyads, really, because his son Abdul Malik rules after him in winning the second fitna. He rules, and his sons all become rulers of the Umayyads. Now, Marwan, when you see him in the first fitna, he is an evil machination. He's even said to have killed Talha, right? Even though he was fighting with Talha, he's the one who prods Uthman to do all these horrible things. So he's a horrible person, right? He's a horrible person. Okay, so then you get, this horrible person, you get in the second fitna. The second fitna, when Muawiyah dies and Yazid becomes the caliph, he sends a message to his governor, who is in Medina, to go collect Al-Hussein bin Ali and Abdullah bin Zubair and force them to give the bay'ah to Yazid. Who stops that governor from forcibly going, sending the shorta, the police, and catching Al-Hussein and stuff? Is Marwan. It's like, what is Marwan doing? Like, he's not in character, right? And he says that this is something, this is the the grandson of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He's a good, these are good and pious people. You cannot do that. You are not to do that. This is what wrong is. And the governor sort of listens to Marwan, and both Al-Hussein and Abdullah bin Zubair are able to avoid that governorship. So that is inconsistency, okay, and inconsistency. So sometimes these characters are utilized in order to build up a certain view and a certain way, in order to help, the story to be, be biased in a certain way. And this is very important also, does Marwan, being the person behind Uthman, sending the letter, writing the letter, killing Talha, if we say Marwan didn't do any of these things, will Uthman be still alive, or Talha be alive? No, because it doesn't affect the story. It only affects the meaning of the story. And that's, Dr. Al-Ajmi and I myself agree that that's when you realize there is some colorful commentary. This is colorful commentary, and really does not really change the essence of the story.
We'll check, inshallah, if the sisters have questions. If you have, please let me know.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair for your talk and all the information, mashallah. I have a very primitive question. I'm not very familiar with, I guess I'm not very well read in general about Islamic history, but I wanted to ask about the notion of Orientalism, and if there is a pattern as to to the motivation of why Orientalists, what is their interest usually in studying Islamic scholarship, and if there are Orientalists in other religions, like are there Jewish people who are extremely interested in Christian scholarship, or like that sort of thing? And then how can a Muslim, I guess what I understood you saying is that you have to look at the author and take it with a grain of salt to understand what their motivation or their framing is of a story or of the historical facts. And yes, I just wanted you to comment a little bit more on who the Orientalists are, and are we supposed, should Muslims trust what they what they write? I guess.
Yeah.
I guess it's like an ethos thing, because they're not insiders.
Okay, thank you. This is an excellent question. I mean, let me go to the last sort of part, and what Dar al-Qasim is doing is exactly what needs to be done in order to stave off this idea, whereby there are Muslim scholars who are studying Islam, and producing works and producing students also from Islam. Orientalism, basically, I mean, to put it in a very, very basic terms, is the product of power. That is, a powerful group colonizing another group is studying them. If we want to think about it, let's think about, for instance, when we study Greek mythology, or the Spartans and Athenians. We are studying, you know, a dead civilization. It has gone, and you come and you sort of look at it and you study it, and sort of you control everything about it. That civilization is not interacting. Well, imagine this. What's going on is that you are studying a live civilization that has, you know, representative of it, but you're ignoring them because you're imposing your will on them. And no, what happened was that there was a little bit of Orientalism that happened with regard to a certain extent when these Semitic languages scholars started to study Judaism. Most of them were Christians who studied to study Judaism, but that power shift completely changed when Jewish scholars went into the field and, you know, took control, meaning they were empowered from the field. This has not happened in Islamic scholarship yet, and there continues to be a very strong divide and a very, very strong power struggle. For instance, you find very few, if none, institutions who give PhD in Islamic studies have their students learn, look, and research the most recent scholarship that is coming out of the Islamic world. When you're doing a PhD, for instance, when I was doing a PhD on Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, right? I had the resources, and I had to go through looking at, you know, all the scholarship that was done in the West on Muawiyah, right? And of course, I put it on myself to look at also all the MAs, all the PhDs, all the books that were done about Muawiyah in the Islamic world. But I put that on myself, right? As a Western scholar, these are all dismissed. You know, they're seen as below par. They're not really source critical. They're not very critical. So there is a complete, leaving of that scholarship, and that is a result of the power of these these institutions. There is an imbalance of power. Okay. And the imbalance of power allows somebody to make statements which are absurd, which are, you know, illogical, and which are from the beginning to to now that are still being made. And it's these statements that are, for lack of a better word, are completely ignorant and racist and biased. For instance, when some scholars from the beginning who looked at the Quran and were in the West and were these scholars of Semitic language, and they look at the Quran and they say, well, the Quran is incoherent. You cannot really understand anything about it. And this sort of continues until to this day. People say the same thing. But what does that mean when you say that, right? You know, it's incoherent because you are incoherent, right? You as a person are unable to look at it in a way that is without the prejudice of what you want or what you think a holy writ has to be like. You have a vision, you have a very conclusion, you want it to be that way. But it is not incoherent for 1 billion people. There is no incoherence about it. So the incoherence lies in you. But you see, because of the powerful nature and because of the power structure that is going on, they're able to say that. And they're able to say that as scholars, which is more dangerous than anything else. Yeah, so this is as if a professional opinion. It's like, for instance, a doctor. Like, imagine a doctor says to you, "Well, you're not human. I'm a doctor and I'm a scientist. You're not human yet." So if a doctor says that, they're a doctor, right? So these are scholars who are using this idea. It's like, no, you're not. This idea, and that is the imbalance. That's Orientalism. That's the problem, and that's a very difficult problem, but it has to be overcome.
Do we have other questions from the sister side? I want to... any questions from here? Maybe one last question. A number of our students are not familiar with the early Islamic sources. So what do you mean by early Islamic sources? And maybe give us an idea about perhaps a couple of them, if possible. Thank you.
Okay, sure. I'm talking about, of course, historical sources. I'm saying early Islamic sources, like, for instance, At-Tabari, right? And most At-Tabari, Yaqubi, Masoudi are all Ibn Atham al-Kufi are all what one would call historians who wrote a history from usually from the death of the Prophet ﷺ till the time that they were living in. And it's usually a political history of the dynasties. So they go for the Rashidun caliphs, and then they go to the Umayyads, and then they go to the Abbasids. And most of these historians wrote around the 9th century. Okay. We do have historians who wrote about a particular incident, and for instance, we have historians like Ibn Mazahim, who wrote about certain small incidents, like the Battle of Siffin, for instance. You have a history of the Battle of Siffin. You have the history of the Ridda Wars by Saif ibn Omar, who we can, if we look at all the sources that Al-Tabari uses, and Masoudi and Al-Baradhari, all these groups that use all different narrations, right? And you look at just the narrations from Saif ibn Omar, people have collected those and created what might have been, because we don't have these books anymore, what might have been their books. So by looking at these narrations. Historians such as Baladhari, Tabari, Yaqubi, Masoudi are collectors. They collect from narrations from different narrators. And they collected and they put it. Sometimes they utilize certain narrations, right? And sometimes we find that they have ignored certain other narrations. And this is one way of finding out what this historian might be their leanings towards. For instance, if you look at Tabari, Tabari will never use a Syrian source. He will only use Iraqi sources or Medinan sources or Hijazi sources. Never will he use a narrator, a historian from Syria. Okay, you know, and I found, for instance, when I was looking at, you know, about Muawiyah, I found that all his stories are from Iraqi sources and from Hijazi sources, never from Syrian sources. Are there Syrian sources on Muawiyah? Yes, there are. And how do we find them? We find that from a much later historian. His name is Ibn Asakir, who made this huge volume called Tarikh Medina Dimashq, where he looks at everybody who has visited Damascus, and he writes a short history of these people. And of course, one can say this is a Rijal, it's a Rijal book, you know, a biography of all these people. And then he has stories. So, and in the stories, he talks about certain incidents that are very different. So these are the early Islamic stories. And from these collections, we can go to earlier and earlier narrations. And we can sort of put together early narrations of these stories.
Okay, well, once again, thank you very much for coming, and inshallah, we would like to see you more often. And thank you very much. Jazakallah khair.